Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him, dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I am not alone. Other friends may fail me, he is still my own. Though his hand may lead me over drearest ways. Anywhere with Jesus is a house of praise. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the dark shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall waken never more to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Amen. Please be seated.
Susan and I are certainly thankful to be with you this morning. We have been here before, but it's been a long, long time. And we're really grateful to the elders for allowing us to be here in the congregation today. And thankful to Ryan for sharing his pulpit with us. And we do have a PowerPoint. I'm just not altogether sure. The young lady who is running the PowerPoint is a student from Lubbock Christian University from years ago. I think we left on good terms. Over the last 3 weeks or so, I have been thinking about the subject of joy. Now, maybe that's because I've wondered in my personal life if I've needed more joy. Or maybe that's because I have been thinking on the campus of Oklahoma Christian, we need joy. Or maybe that's because I have been looking at families and I've been looking at congregations and I've been thinking maybe everybody needs a bit more joy. And then I have been told, though I did not know, I have been told that the book of Philippians is supposed to be a book about joy. I remember a Bible professor at Oklahoma Christian from years gone by named Avon Malone. And Avon Malone would go across the country and he would preach from the book of Philippians and he would preach on the subject of joy. And so I thought, I'll take a look at the book of Philippians. I'll skim through it. I'll see if I can see anything there that pertains to joy. And so one particular day, I was reading through the first chapter, kind of skimming through the first chapter, looking for something on joy. When I finished that, I picked up a book. I'd been wanting to read this book. It was a book supposedly about leadership, unconventional leadership. It was written by David Green, the founder, the CEO of Hobby Lobby. Now, this book was written 2 years ago, and at the time he was 80 years old. And though he's talking about leadership lessons, he's talking about a lot of Hobby Lobby stories. How over the last 50 years, it has gone from literally nothing to today, more than 8 billion sales annually. But he tells stories in the book, and he talks about how in the mid-1980s, for example, he was heavily in debt. Some of you might remember in the mid-1980s the oil collapse here in Texas and in Oklahoma and other places. And his sales plummeted. And creditors were calling, and he was wondering, how can I pay my bills? He literally says, I would crawl under my desk and hide. And I would beg God for some kind of answer. Or he tells a story about the beginning of the pandemic, when the first 19 of his stores closed. And ultimately all would close. And when the stores are closed, there are no sales. And his question was, how do I pay 50,000 of my employees? And he said, every morning and every day at noon and every night, my wife and I would get on our knees and we would together beg God for some kind of answer. And he tells a story about how over and over again, though he could not understand it, he could not see it, how God would provide something good. And so as I thought about the story, the book, at least the first half of the book, I came up with two phrases, as I often do, trying to summarize things. Here are the two phrases. Number one, God is always present. He is always present. Number two, God is always working. Even when you can't see it, even when you don't understand it, God is always present and God is always working. Well, that's kind of the start to our peek into the first chapter of the book of Philippians. But before we get into the book of First Philippians, I want to ask you a couple of questions. The first is this question. How was your week this last week? How was your week? Now, I attended a Bible class. Susan and I attended a Bible class over in the gymnasium. Actually, the fellow teaching the Bible class stole my lesson, okay? My recommendation is that he preach next Sunday. I mean, it was really good, really, really good. But I noticed in the announcements prior to him teaching that lesson, how many people were talking about so many difficulties. How was your week last week? And if someone said, or if several of you said, my week last week was absolutely filled with all kinds of stress, I would not be surprised. Or if you said, my week last week was one problem after another, I would not be surprised at all. Or if someone said in this audience, last week was the week I got some really bad news, and I wasn't expecting this news. It came out of nowhere, and it was really, really difficult. I too would understand that. And if someone in the audience this morning would dare to say, my week last week was a no good, lousy week, I would understand that one also. Because life is filled with problems. And life sometimes is so very, very difficult. And everyone here understands that. Everyone. I think it was on the July 4th holiday. Sue's texted three or four of her distant friends, people who lived in the distance. And she was telling me about some of the responses. And 2 or 3 of those responses were people responding to her saying, this is what life has been like for me in the last bit of time. And it was horrible. It was difficult. It was filled with problems. And it sounded to me like they were saying, my week last week was a no good, lousy week. But I have a second question for you. How did you live last week? How did you really live last week? Moaning, groaning, worried? Or was there any joy? Even in those weeks that are so very difficult, even in those times that are so very hard, was there any joy? And that's why I'm trying to think for a while about the subject of joy. Because the hard weeks will never go away. And yet we are called as kingdom people to be people of joy. And so now finally, to chapter 1 of the book of Philippians. Only 2 or 3 verses. Because what you're going to find in the first chapter is that Paul identifies where he is when he's writing this letter. He says, I am in chains. I'm in prison. The Romans have me in chains. Now, no matter what happened last week, if I had been in chains last week, if I had been in Roman chains last week, I think I would say it was a no good, lousy week. Would you say that? If you've been chains? But then I began to think about Paul's life. What was Paul's life really like? We don't know when he was a young person. We don't know exactly what it was like, but I've always kind of felt like maybe he kind of grew up in a life of affluence. At least his parents were able to send him away to some schooling with really qualified scholars, Jewish scholars. And I know he grew up in that one sect of Judaism, kind of the supreme sect, the Pharisees. And I know as a young man, being highly educated, he was rising faster and faster through the ranks of Phariseeism. And everything seemed to be going his way. Until he found himself in Damascus. You remember? A very unusual experience. You remember this man named Ananias coming to him? And finally Ananias said, Saul, or we call him Paul, what are you waiting for? Get up and get baptized and wash away your sins. And at that moment, he entered into the kingdom of heaven. He entered into the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And nothing was ever the same again for Paul. Nothing. Do you know? But from that very moment, people began to chase him. And often they caught him. And when they caught him, they would beat him. And sometimes they would chase him. And they would catch him, and not only would they beat him, they would put him in prison. That's what happened the first time he was in Philippi. Remember the first time he was in Philippi? They beat him. They put him in the dungeon. Oh, by the way, I would have called that a no good, lousy week. He was singing. He was singing. Do you know that one time, at least one time, they stoned him to the point they thought he was dead? You know that 3 times he suffered shipwreck, and we have one of those accounts in Acts chapter 27. And can you even possibly imagine being in a little wooden boat in the midst of a sea, in the blackness of the night, bouncing back and forth to the point that it breaks apart? You're thrown out into the water. How terrifying. He was bitten by a poisonous snake. He had something wrong with him. Have no idea what it was. Something that caused pain, or something that distracted him, something that was an annoyance. Apparently something physically, he calls it a thorn in the flesh. He said, I asked God once and twice, asked him 3 times, will you take this away? Life could be so much better for me. My ministry would be so much more effective. Will you take it away? And God said no. God said no. I wonder how many weeks, at the end of the week, Paul could have looked back and he could have said, this was a no good, lousy week. And yet I want you to read these few verses with me together, beginning in verse 12 of chapter 1. And as you listen to the verses, I want you to think about Paul's attitude. I want you to think about what Paul is feeling as you read these verses in Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 12. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear that throughout the whole palace guard and everywhere else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of my brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord. And they dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. How did he sound to you? How did he sound to you? Do you feel his exuberance? Do you feel like he's almost excited? I mean, he's changed, but look what God is doing. Do you think maybe there is joy in those words? And I found myself wondering a couple of weeks ago, is Paul also understanding the principles? Is he understanding that God is always present and that God is always working even when it doesn't feel like it or seem like it? Now, all of you understanding this? God is always present. He's always working, even though I can't quite see it at the moment. So I want to take you back to the Old Testament very quickly. 2 illustrations. I think you'll be disappointed because they're so worn out. You know them so well. And yet maybe I can present them with a little bit different perspective. So the first is these people that are the descendants of Abraham or the descendants of Isaac or the descendants of Jacob. And Jacob was called Israel. So we call them the children of Israel. Now, their existence is in Egypt. And their job is to be a slave. And they're under the whip of the Egyptian taskmaster every single day. Make the bricks and make them faster. And those Egyptian taskmasters aren't afraid to crack the whip against the skin. And don't you know that every week, at the end of the week, they can come home and they can look back and say, another no good, lousy week? And maybe stories about God have been passed down. But they had no personal experience with God. Nor had their parents, nor had their grandparents, nor had their great-grandparents. And more than that. But one day Moses comes. And Moses is calling for them to be released. And suddenly there are these, we call them plagues or miracles, that come from the hand of God. And they've never seen anything like it before. And about 10 of them is all Pharaoh can take. And so he says, get out of here. And they go. Now they could have gone a short distance, crossed a river, and been in the land that God had promised Abraham that he would give to these people. But I got to tell you something. Everybody needs to hear. This faith thing, this trust thing, it doesn't come quickly. It doesn't come easily. You have to grow so that you can understand that God is always present and God is always working no matter what. And so God says, Moses, let's take them down another way. It's longer. They get down beside the sea. They're camped there. All is okay until they look into the desert distance and they see dust. And then they begin to discover it's the dust from the wheels of chariots, 600 chariots. And then they can begin to see, and those are the chariots of Pharaoh. Oh, Pharaoh's coming, and Pharaoh's coming with a vengeance. And they panic. Now, I don't fault them. I don't fault them at this moment because I don't care how strong your faith is when you get the phone call and you've had that first information and it's such a shock to you. We all struggle, don't we? Don't we all struggle? It takes a while. It takes a moment. But they keep going. Why did you get us out here like this? We'd rather make bricks and die here. Then suddenly, the waters of the sea part. And they move across. The ground, by the way, is dry. And they all get across, and they look back, and here comes Pharaoh with all those chariots, and he's so angry, and he gets right in the middle of that sea, and the waters come tumbling in, and Pharaoh is no more. Wow. I'm beginning to understand that when I can't see a way out, God is always present, and he's always working. Now they get down to the river. Just a matter of crossing the river. You know, God sends over the spies. Now, God doesn't need any spies. But the spies go over. The spies, they're gone a long time. That's one of the problems. They're gone 40 days. I can imagine 40 days felt like a long time to those people. Spies get back. Most of them are saying, wow, it's really a good land. Be fun to live there. But don't even think about crossing over. Don't even go there. Because if you cross over, you're going to find giants. And you cross over, you're going to find these great big cities that got big walls around them, and we'll die. 10 of the 12 were saying it that way. And the people believed the negative story. And they wail, and they moan, and they groan, and they never learn this faith lesson, by the way. They never get it. And every one of them is sent out into the desert wilderness until everyone over the age of 20 is dead. And I don't know what they do in the wilderness except just go this way and go that way and wander around. And every day is hot and every day is dirty and the sand is always blowing. And every week for the rest of their lives is a lousy, no good week, and there's no joy. Those faithless people. Now, everybody understand this? There is no joy. You can't find the right joy in this life without a connection to God, knowing that God is always present and God is always working. So one other, young boy, shepherd boy. You know what I'm talking about? David. He's the youngest boy in the family. His job is to take care of sheep. But one day his dad says, I want you to go visit your brothers. I want you to go visit the army of Saul. And you can see the smile coming across his face because this is vacation. I get to leave the sheep. I get to go. It's vacation time. And you can almost see him skipping on his way to the army of Saul. You remember what he finds when he gets there? I'm telling you, the army of Saul, even up to Saul himself, they've had a no good, lousy week. In fact, they've had several no good, lousy weeks. For 40 days, there's a giant that's been walking out in the valley saying, are you cowards? Why don't you come and fight? And they hide. They don't get it. That God is present and God is working. But David, why he just keeps on smiling? Can't you see it? And David just keeps on with this spirit of joy. And he said, I'll do that. I'll go out and fight. Why, David? Why would you consider that? Because I've already experienced this thing. I mean, you know when I was even smaller than this, I was out there taking care of my sheep. And one day a lion came. I'm no match for a lion. Snatched one of my sheep. The lion's no more because God gave him to me. And you know, another time a bear came, and what could a little boy like me do against a bear? And he snatches one of my sheep, and God gave him to me. Now, how can I think any differently? But that if God did that for me, why can't he do that out there for me in the valley? And so he marches right down there. He cuts off that guy's head. Have you ever tried to visualize what it might have looked like for him to carry by the hair that severed head back over to the side of the army of Israel? And he's all smiles and he's bouncing and says, see, God is always present and God is always working. Now I know that David made some big mistakes in his life. And I know he paid dearly for them. And I know that Saul ultimately will abuse David so badly. That's what that Bible class this morning was about. I'm so glad Susan and I stumbled into that particular class because he was reading Psalms chapter 13. And it's David saying, God, where are you? God, are you? I'm here and I'm hurting and I've got this massive problem, God. You know how that feels, don't you? You know how that feels. Everybody should know how that feels. You've been there. But in all those Psalms, you know how David will end? He'll come back and say, but God, you're my rock. You're my Redeemer. You're my Savior. You're going to take care of this. And he ends with a statement of joy. Every single psalm where he talks about how bad it is, he ends with a statement of joy because that's what faith people do. And that's what kingdom people do. They live their lives as hard as it is. And it'll never get any easier. Life is going to be hard. But faith, kingdom people go through life over and over again, every day, time and time again, during the day, say, God's here. God's working. So why not smile? Why not smile? Do all of you understand that this morning? As kingdom people, People who belong to Jesus Christ. People who have been purchased by the blood of Jesus Christ. Why shouldn't we be filled with joy in the midst of all this mess? Why shouldn't we? The song leader did such a great job, didn't he? I mean, song after song was about joy. Why shouldn't we shine in this dark world like stars in the sky? And why wouldn't you want to be a part of the kingdom of Jesus Christ? Because if you live in this world without Jesus, I got to tell you that week after week, maybe not every week, but week after week, you're going to be saying it was a no good, lousy week, and it's going to stay that way for a while. But in the kingdom of Jesus Christ, you may say that, but say, but God, I know you're there, and I know you're going to work this out somehow. I know you do work things for my good. I want to be on your side because you want to be on my side. Isn't that a great invitation? Why wouldn't you want to be a part of the kingdom of Jesus Christ? While we stand and sing.
Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful day, a day I will never forget. After I'd wandered in darkness away, Jesus, my Savior, I met. Oh, what a tender, compassionate friend, He met the need of my heart. Shouts dispelling with joy, I am telling, He made all the darkness depart. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When at the cross the Savior made me whole, my sins were washed away, and my night was turned to day. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. Born of the Spirit with life from above, into God's family divine. Justified fully through Calvary's love, oh, what a standing is mine. And the transaction so quickly was made, when as a sinner I came. Took the offer of grace, did proffer, He saved me, oh, praise His dear name. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When at the cross the Savior made me whole. My sins were washed away, and my night was turned to day. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. Now I've a hope that will surely endure after the passing of time. I have a future in heaven for sure, there in those mansions sublime. And it's because of that wonderful day, when at the cross I believed, riches eternal and blessed, supernal from His precious hand I received. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When at the cross the Savior made me whole, my sins were washed away.